Right. So here we go. Yeah. So I could use it. Why don't I just use the mouse? That's a hell of a lot easier, actually, right? Because you can see the mouse, right? So faith in a meta-narrative, so lots of stories. We have stories, the three bears, but also, stories like when I left home this morning, there was snow on the ground. And so I had to be careful because I was driving through snow. But fortunately, there were some other people that had driven the same way, and I kind of followed their trail, and it turned out to be a good one. I ended up getting where I wanted to be. That's a story, right? But a meta-narrative, or a meta-story, is a story that is the bigger story that includes all of my stories. So I've got lots of stories that explain me. I'm a father, so I have a whole story that tries to explain how to be a good father. I'm a husband. I try to explain, how to be a good husband. Good teacher, right? Teacher, really just pretending, but I'm fooling a lot of people. 30 years, actually, But in any case, these are all stories that explain how I can play the role, to act the way I'm supposed to, according to what I've learned, is the role in that particular story, and that enables me to, fulfill the role of being a teacher, Now, but notice I've got all these different stories. Do they ever come in conflict? Yeah, sometimes you're supposed to be at work, but at the same time you've got to take your child to the doctor. Or on a day like this, you're supposed to be at work, but the school says, well, it's going to be a remote school day. Everybody stay home. And if you're a parent of, 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 or 10 children, however many you have, I don't know if you have 10 children or not. I met a family that had 14 children, if I remember correctly. They're called the Pilgrim family. Have you heard them? They used to live in, when we first met them, we bought a dog from them. It was a black and white Newfoundland, and we had to drive down to the Kenai Peninsula to their farm, and we bought the dog from them. Later, they were just renting the farm. They later used the permanent fund dividend checks for the whole family to buy property in a park, which they got in trouble because they plowed a road through the park to their property, which you weren't allowed to do without all kinds of etc. In any case, they ended up finally in Wasilla and so on. But when we came in for the dog, it was amazing because every single child looked like the others with that little difference. So you knew this is a family resemblance and so on. But that's a whole nother story. A meta-narrative is the story that you believe in that explains how you resolve the conflicts between all the other stories, the smaller everyday stories that you try to live your life by, right? So the meta-narrative is the big story. And that could be the one, of course, that explains who you are, what your role is, in the whole big story, and of course your place in the universe. So those three things that a philosophy needs to explain for you. So belief in a meta-narrative, for me, is belief in that story that I use in order to organize my decision. Well, what's more important, staying home with the child? Can't leave the child home without adult supervision, so I'm going to have to call in to work, etc. All those things. Do I join the military in order to fight for my country? Whoa, what does that mean compared to taking care of all the other stories that just imagine how you try to niche those stories in to one another. And of course the traditional meta-narratives are the ones that we think of as like the Hindu religion, the Buddhist philosophy, probably not a religion, Christianity, and all the different variants, which you could look. We'll look at some of this later on, and so on. So, would this actually be encompassed by a religion? Certainly. Many of the religions, we could argue that they've used the Platonic philosophy to explain the physical world, and then explain how you live in terms of that philosophy of the universe and how the physical world works. Christianity, we think of there being a relationship between Jerusalem and Athens. Why Athens? Well, Athens is where the philosophy comes from that at the time would have been Plato's philosophy. And Jerusalem, of course, would be the Christian, actually the Jewish as well. They both end up viewing the universe pretty much through the same kind of Platonic view. So, yes, the answer is yes. Long way around, but the answer is yes. So that's fun. I like that. So belief in a meta-narrative, and I compare it to a couple other folks. Did you see how I got to that page? If you're interested, it's all my notes down at the bottom. Other items of interest I have. What is religion? What is a person? I have some of these that are fun to do. So let's get out of that tool and get back to Plato. So this is actually pretty easy to figure out, right? If you're initially experiencing what we might call a mirage in the desert, you're looking at I guess the joke is the guy sees, he's dragging himself around in the sand because he's dying of thirst, and he sees a Coke machine in the distance, and so he crawls up to it and he's saved, and then he gets up and he realizes it's not a Coke machine, it's a Pepsi machine. That's supposed to be funny. I didn't. It's funnier when you see it. The guy's disappointed, that he's found a Pepsi machine instead of a Coke machine. We don't trust mirages. I don't know why anybody would go to a casino named Mirage. That sounds like, come in here and lose your money. That's. By the way, if anyone's interested, I have a surefire way of winning money at a casino. If you're ever interested. The way I always do it, I go in, I sign in, you register. They give you a card with an initial $25. And you go over and you put it into a slot machine and you spend it until you get it to the point where it's balanced out enough that you can cash it in. And I usually wait till I get around $5 and I cash it in, and that's the last I gamble the whole time I'm in that casino. So I win $5 every time, or roughly $5. You could get carried away and end up only winning $4.10 or something, but that could have been funny too. My jokes are just not hilarious, I guess. Okay. So, illusions, we don't trust those. The next are beliefs, and what are the beliefs? Now, this is in the visual world, so remember for Plato, tables and chairs and things that we think of as objects, and today we think, well, that's reality. Where did that come from? We'll start to see even today, right? But for Plato, that's not reality. Instead, you have to go on to discourse, and what he means are these dialogues that he's having, where you basically use a logical argument in order to figure out, hey, that's not really true. Neither is this. Neither is this. Neither is this. You don't quite actually get any answers, at least in the earlier dialogue. Then finally, you end up, and notice mathematics. How many folks believe that 1 + 1 = 2? Everybody. Yes? Nobody disagrees with that? Huh. Of course, there are some interesting issues. Do we have squares on the Earth? I mean, if you look at, say, the lines of longitude and latitude, oops. Go away. Images. Okay, so there you go. You know what I mean, right? These look like rectangles actually, right? But what about in hyperbolic geometry? In math. Where's Daniel today? Snow, probably. And there's another, I think, math major over here. Why do the math majors always sit up front? Or is that true? I shouldn't pick on math majors, but you look puzzled. Are you a math major?
No, sometimes I'm not good at math.
Ah, that's me. Yes. I like math theory, but give me 2 plus 2 and I'm like, 5? No, it can be bad. But in any case, if you're using hyperbolic geometry, there are no squares. Because we're talking about curved spaces. And if you have a curved space, there is no actual right angle. And so, but the trouble is if you're using hyperbolic, am I saying it right? Hyperbolic geometry? I don't really know even how to say it. Hyperbolic? In any case, it's a different paradigm, and as a result, and by the way, a lot of, I think, physicists will tell us that that's the nature of space. Space is curved space, right? The reason I'm staying on the floor isn't because there's some mythical thing called gravity that's pulling me down. It's instead because the Earth is traveling in a curved space and I'm traveling in a curved space, and the two of us keep kind of like hugging one another because of our movement. And so as a result, I'm on the ground. It's hard as heck when you're driving, if you're driving down the Glen Highway and you're trying to think, okay, the Earth is traveling in what, 2,400 miles an hour? Something like that, in a circle, and I'm going in a particular direction, say north, and so the spin is going this, far, and so I'm trying to hold, to the road. It's a lot easier to just think, the Earth is flat, it's not moving, I'm moving on it, So the flat Earth thing works really well when you're driving, so that you don't, end up having all these calculations in your head, which just totally throw you. So the point of this is, we trust math, but there are arguments over different mathematical systems. Is the hyperbolic geometry the true geometry? Or is it Euclidean geometry, which believes in straight lines and stuff, which, according to hyperbolic geometry, proposition 5 is wrong. Two parallel lines actually do meet, right? So, can you really trust math? Well, let's kind of stick that temporarily, at least in a slot, and say, okay, so mathematics is a particular context. Another model. When we're thinking of the model-dependent realism, well, if we're using this model, this all works, and those are true in the context of that model. But as Einstein says, truth is within the context of a model. When you step outside of the model, and you've got multiple models to compare to, now you have relativity, right? Because there's different opportunities for you, right? So maybe even math turns out to be something a little bit different than a sure thing. For Plato, it was definitely something absolute, though. So he wasn't involved in a concept of relativity, even though I think people like Heraclitus might have been. There might have been arguments, etc., at that time period. But there you go. But there are problems, of course, with this philosophy, the idealist philosophy. You can probably already come up with lots of them. It seems really weird, number one, because this feels like terra firma, which is Latin for solid ground, right? And so it seems very trustworthy. Ideas, on the other hand, end up causing problems. For example, in the Parmenides, which is one of the dialogues where it's probably a late dialogue and where Plato really has difficulties with Parmenides and Zeno and others that are criticizing the idealist philosophy. And that brings up things like, well, infinity would be one issue. But another one is, say, the colors. We have different colors. You think of the color wheel. Right, we've got all these different colors. You know what I'm talking about here, right? Is that going to help? Okay.